after the meeting. And then also, if everybody can just make sure to be conscious of keeping themselves on mute unless they're speaking. If you'd like to chime in or add anything, you can raise your hand or drop a question in the chat. And with that, I think we can go ahead and get going here with our first presentation on trout bioenergetics as a method to evaluate ecological risk of diversion rates in the Upper Shasta River. This will be presented by Suzanne Rhodes and Natalie Stoffer-Olsen.
Thanks, folks. So again, I'm Natalie Stoffer-Olsen with Trout Unlimited, and I'm just going to briefly set the stage here for Suzanne to get into some of the technical details, which we think y'all will be really interested in. We've been working on the Upper Shasta River since 2014. We're a collaborative group, TU, Trout Unlimited, the University of Nevada, Reno, and McMain Associates, as well as some local folks, are all in the group, and we call ourselves the Upper Shasta River Restoration Group. So this work started about a decade ago. We started to look at fish feeding and movement patterns and bioenergetics and how fish feeding behavior changed with flow. And the aim with this work, which was conducted mostly by PhD students at UNR, the aim was to determine flows that would keep fish in good condition below a water diversion for a group of water users. And then the fish ladder that was put right next to the diversion because of litigation in the area related to this fish in good condition issue. In 2018, TU was pulled in and the group became a bit more collaborative and dynamic, and we wanted to work more explicitly with water users to create some flow recommendations that would keep fish in good condition. Can folks hear me okay? I'm hearing a few people. We all good? Great, thanks. So we really think of ourselves as kind of this collaborative group. We're trying to work with water users. We're trying to have this transparent approach, and we're really using science to ground ourselves and to, try to come up with some win-win situations based off of information that we gather. So we like to think of ourselves as non-biased scientists and also people who are really willing to have some difficult conversations, willing to figure out how to get the most bang for the buck related to water. That's kind of a term that we use a lot. And so how can we get the most ecological benefit for fish in particular, but also for the whole ecosystem? We look at primary productivity, we look at benthic invertebrates, and the goal here again is to make it so that people and livestock can both coexist, can both be viable, can both be healthy, and of course be in good condition too. So Suzanne will get into this, but we did publish a paper on this work last fall. We have another that is almost getting published. We just need to send in some edits. And we also created an in-stream flow report, which has specific flow recommendations based off of a variety of different methods. We're currently working with water users in the area to make sure that they feel more or less comfortable with how at least the information is framed before we send this out, but we are starting to share the information that we've been gathering. And again, we're trying to do it in a sensitive way because we do want to collaborate with local water users and make sure that we can try to keep everybody viable as best as we can. Also, again, we'll probably plug this again, but we are planning a gathering in May or June, which is going to be on site and also in Mount Shasta, we think at the museum there. So if you'd like to attend after hearing a bit more about our work, please feel free to reach out to us. Our emails are right here, both Suzanne's and mine. And without further ado, thank you all. And Suzanne, I'll kick it off with you. Thanks again.
Yeah, Natalie, do you want to mention our partners?
Yeah, I briefly mentioned our partners. We're also funded by, we are funded by NIMS or NIFWIF and the Marine Community Foundation.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks, Natalie, for that introduction. So I'm going to dive into the technical details of our most recent work that was published in this paper this fall, and we can We have a link at the end that we can send out, and we're happy to share this paper with folks. And before I kind of dive in here, I want to talk a little bit about the natural flow regime. And I know this is not new information for this audience, but in Poff and others' 1997 foundational paper, they talk about the fact that the flow regime is really of central importance in sustaining the ecological integrity of flowing water systems. And this is really an underlying principle in our work that we'll talk about today, and the fact that we should let the natural flow regime guide our in-stream flow assessments. There's a lot of background noise from somebody.
Yeah, gentle reminder to be on mute unless you're
Yeah.
talking. Thanks, folks.
We'll carry on.
Thank you.
So today we'll be letting the natural flow regime really guide our in-stream flow assessments. And this is where the CEF framework can help as well in helping identify what these functional flows are and helping us develop flow ecology predictions related to these functional flows. And the fact that these unimpaired flows of the natural flow regime should really be a point of reference for any in-stream flow assessment moving forward. So next I'll talk about these kind of two approaches to assessing in-stream flows. The first is this bottom-up approach, where every drop of water needs to be justified for an ecological or geomorphic need. So in this approach, we're talking about developing belly scraping flows for fish passage or for maintaining fish growth or condition in extremely dry years, and not much more than that. And in this kind of framework or approach, the question we're asking is, how much water does a river need? In contrast, what we'll talk about today and where we're trying to switch the conversation towards is this top-down approach, where any alteration to the natural flow regime has an ecological impact. And Tharm 2003, and kind of one of the papers that initially put this framework on the map, suggested that there's this need to determine an acceptable level of departure from the natural hydrograph. And in this approach, we're shifting the question to how much can we alter the hydrograph, or what is the risk of altering the hydrograph? And it's shifting the burden of proof from building the hydrograph from the bottom up, from every drop of water, to keeping the hydrograph as close to unimpaired as possible and removing as little water as we can justify, or as for how much risk we can tolerate. And within this framework, we think these percent of flow diversions fit really nicely within this top-down framework. So percent of flow diversions allow for the hydrograph to be altered within these sustainable boundaries. So we're comparing any alteration to the hydrograph. This could also be an increase, or more commonly, and what we'll talk about today, is a decrease or diversion rate from the unimpaired hydrograph. But thinking about this as a percent of flow diversion rate rather than stepwise water amounts inherently maintains the functional flows and natural hydrologic variability. And this creates a rich hydrograph and precludes the need to develop flow ecology relationships for every single little blip in the hydrograph that may occur and have some unknown function that we can't quantify, because the natural flow regime is immensely complex. The next point that I'll talk about here is that there's this opportunity in California to relate in-stream flows for fish in good condition. And the California Fish and Game Code 5397 requires that fish are kept in good condition below dams and diversions. And this is an opportunity for us to think about what stream flows maintain fish in good condition, or what alteration will maintain fish in good condition. This has been previously defined by Peter Moyle et al. In 1998 paper to have 3 tiers, and we can think about it in that way. The first is this tier 1, or individual fish condition, where fish are in reasonable health, disease and parasite free, and have reasonable growth for the region. And there's really kind of a need for metrics that link to this tier 1 individual fish condition, because it forms the foundation for tier 2, which is populations, where multiple age classes are present, life history stages have enough habitat and can move around, and there's a viable population size. And then moving even larger, the third tier is fish community, that we would like to see communities that are dominated by native species, persistent through time, and replicated geographically. To date, most of the in-stream flow assessments address this kind of tier 2 population metrics where life history stages have enough habitat and can move around. And these are flow habitat curves like WUA curves or critical riffle analysis. But there's kind of a need for these metrics that more directly address individual fish in good condition. And we're going to talk about today how bioenergetics models can potentially fill that gap because they have an estimate or a metric for growth that can be compared to growth rates or condition in that region. Okay, so with all of the introduction, I'm going to jump in today into our case study into the Upper Shasta River. This is a site that's above Twinnell Dam, so rainbow trout are the native species of interest, but there is potential for anadromany one day. There are hydrologic inputs from rainfall, snowmelt, and springs, and the streams maintain relatively cool temperatures in the summer. And we'll be looking at conditions above and below one major point of diversion, where up to 98% of the stream flows are diverted in the summer months. That said, there are other diversions in the region that contribute to impairing the hydrograph, other smaller diversions, but most of the comparisons that we'll talk about today are either above and below this one diversion point. Current alterations to the hydrograph at this point are highest in the spring, summer, and fall months. So the winter peaks are relatively maintained. We see the highest, and then the impaired below diversion hydrograph tends to deviate during the snowmelt runoff season, summer base flow, and in the fall months as well. So our main study question for this case study was, how much can we alter the hydrograph without risking change to condition of native rainbow trout? And we have 3 project elements that we'll talk about today. The first is estimating the impact of current large diversions on rainbow trout using bioenergetic conditions. Second is to validate these bioenergetics models with field data. And third is to estimate maximum allowable diversion rates that minimize risk of altering rainbow trout condition using bioenergetics. The bioenergetics models have this potential to fill this tier 1 fish in good condition. And there are also process-based models that incorporate how depth, velocity, and food resource influence profitability of trout. So they are mechanistic models that really integrate these other variables that are commonly used in in-stream flow assessments. Profitability is estimated as net rate of energetic intake, or NREI. This can be considered a proxy for growth condition. And the models are mechanistic, and they're driven really by this understanding of how physical habitat and food alters foraging conditions for drift foraging trout. The models that we implemented today are in the software Bioenergetics HSC. This software was released in 2020, and there's a graphic user interface. It's freely available to download online, and it is very easy to use. So the possibility of using this at other sites definitely is a strong one. So to estimate existing bioenergetic conditions, we took drift samples at sites above and below this large diversion, including in riffles and pools. We developed depth and velocity transects that were taken from 2D hydraulic model, and we empirically measured water temperatures. And then we put these variables together into Bioenergetics HSC to understand how NREI differs above and below the diversion. And what we found is that NREI is almost always lower below this large diversion. And this is more true in pools than in riffles, and that's because pools are more profitable foraging places. So there's more to lose in a pool. In a riffle, it's a worse foraging place as estimated by the model, and so they are worse, but not quite as bad as the reduction in NREI in pool habitats. So moving forward, we'll mostly focus just on pool habitats because that's the more conservative habitat to think about. And we found that NREI was most reduced in these low flow months. So in these really low flow months of July, August, September, and even in December in this particular year, we found that NREI was reduced by over 80%, almost 90% in these low flow months, especially in the pool habitat. So we did some field validation of these bioenergetics models. We conducted electrofishing surveys to estimate the density and size of rainbow trout and brown trout, and I'll just talk about the rainbow trout results today. Rainbow trout were found in lower densities below the diversion and across several years. And rainbow trout were smaller below the diversion as well within each age class. So age 0 and age 1 fish were always smaller below the diversion. So these kind of validated our bioenergetics models, and the fact that we were predicting that condition would be below the diversion was validated by the fact that there were fewer fish there, and the ones that were there were smaller as well. We also did some video work to see if we could observe the behavior of the fish above and below the diversion. And we did this by placing GoPros underwater and looking at videos of the behavior that fish were doing. And we found that above the diversion in this one summer of 2019, fish were drift feeding for most of the time, whereas below the diversion, fish switched to benthic feeding much earlier in the summer, almost a month sooner. And so this also validated our predictions that growth conditions were lower below the diversion. And now I'm going to move to this last part of our work here, where we're then thinking about how can we estimate allowable diversions using bioenergetics. So we know that trout condition is lower below the diversion, but at what level can we still divert water and see that the condition or the bioenergetics of the fish falls within the natural range that we would predict to see? And again, this is thinking about this in this percent of flow or sustainable boundary approach, where we're looking at the unimpaired flows as our reference condition, and then we're changing the percent of flow diversions to think about what our impacts are and how we're increasing ecological risk by increasing these diversion rates. For this part of the study, we're going to focus on just the spring and summer months. We pieced together this conceptual model of our understanding of the Upper Shasta River, and these are the ecologically productive months when we were seeing increasing food resources and warming stream temperatures, and when we think we'd want to be either optimizing trout growth or maintaining trout growth during this sensitive summer dry period. But we do think there are other potential relevant metrics that could be used to assess flows in the fall, winter, and early spring, but we're not going to talk about them explicitly right now as a bioenergetics. So our question here is, how much can we alter the hydrograph so the altered range of NREI falls within the natural range of NREI? And we know that in a system like the Upper Shasta River, if we look at unimpaired flows across a time series, there's quite a range in the unimpaired flows that you would see. So in some years, spring and summer flows are pretty high, and some years spring and summer flows are really low. And that creates this range of unimpaired NREI that we would expect to see across these same years. And then if we think about, okay, so what do flows look like if we take out half of the water? So we take out quite a bit of the water. Well, of course, our flows drop by 50% if we're diverting 50% of the water. And then we can also look at what an REI would look like under this scenario where we divert 50% of the water. In this really high diversion scenario, we see that NREI falls outside of the range of what unimpaired NREI would look like. And these two would be statistically different from each other. But our question was, there must be a percent of flow rate, allowable percent of flow diversion rate in between the unimpaired and in between this really high diversion rate that maintains NREI within the range of natural variation that we would expect to see in an unimpaired system. Thinking across the fact that there are dry years and wet years and quite a bit of natural variability. So our ingredients for this analysis were first a time series of unimpaired flow data. We do have some on-site flow gauging data, and we regressed this with the USGS gauge data for the Trinity River above Coffee Creek. This was from 1962 onward, so this is a pretty lengthy time series. And our regression will be continued to be improved with ongoing gauging, but it was actually pretty good to start with. And then we developed these NREI flow curves. And so NREI was estimated across a range of flows. This was developed using depth and velocity transects from our 2D hydraulic models. And then we developed monthly drift concentration input files that were estimated from field studies across both dry years and wet years. So we integrated drift data from 2015, which was a very dry year, and 2019, which was a more normal and wet year. to develop these input files. So piecing it together, this is what our workflow looked like here, where we had depth and velocity transects for every flow. We had these monthly depth and velocity NREI surfaces that we then used to create these NREI flow curves here. And then we compared those to what flows would look like under an unimpaired hydrograph or an impaired hydrograph, depending on your flow scenario. And that allowed us to create these unimpaired NREI time series, or this time series of NREI at these different percent of flow diversion scenarios. So first I'm going to talk about some of the 3 of the scenarios that we used at first, which were 75% diversion rate, 50% diversion rate, and 25% diversion rate. And we did these kind of coarse diversion scenarios to understand what the trends were as you continue to divert water, and also find the range where we should really start to kind of fine-tune the knob to understand what is the maximum allowable diversion rate. So these were our initial scenarios, and I'll talk about these ones. And again, I'm going to focus on just the pool habitat because this was the more conservative habitat here. And our results for these initial flow scenarios depended on the month. In the lower flow months, which for this particular site was really July, August, and September, we found that higher percent of flow decreases NREI, and this is what we expected to find. And it happened in almost kind of a linear fashion, where as you increased your diversion rate, you decreased NREI really in a proportional manner. In May and June, which are higher flow months because of the snow melt runoff here, NREI was similar or even potentially higher under increasing percent of flow scenarios. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So we kind of zoomed in on these low flow months here because we figured out that this was probably a better metric for these low flow months. And so again, our question here was, what is the highest allowable percent of flow rate? And we conducted this ratcheting where we compared NREI under percent of flow diversion scenarios in 1% increments to the unimpaired NREI range until we found the NREI was significantly reduced or significantly lower than NREI under an unimpaired flow scenario. And we did this across all months. And we think this is probably the best metric for these low flow months. The highest allowable percent of flow varied by month and habitat. The recommended maximum percent of flow diversion rates were less than 16% in July and less than 9% in August and September. And this was using the pool habitat, which was the more conservative habitat. You can see in this table here that in the high flow months, are using this metric only, our highest allowable percent of flow was over 50%. And that's because in these high flow months, we have to think about what this NREI flow curve looks like. And for our NREI flow curve, we see that it peaks or hitting maximum NREI at around 35 CFS. So any flow diversion that moves the flow closer to the optimum will actually predict that we're increasing NREI. That said, we think that there's kind of a need to think about what other metrics are appropriate in these higher flow months, because the only goal here is not to create a rainbow trout hatchery where we're just optimizing for growth across all months. And so there's also a need for spawning habitat or even other non-fish related objectives like riparian vegetation maintenance, floodplain connectivity. And we think there's a potential to use this same framework where we're comparing metrics to the unimpaired conditions with any flow habitat or flow ecology curve, and potentially layering on more appropriate ones during these higher flow months. So in summary, we found that bioenergetics models predicted that the current diversion is impacting rainbow trout energetic condition. We found that rainbow trout energetics were significantly lower below the diversion compared to above. And these were validated by field studies where we found that size and density the fish were smaller and in lower densities below the diversion, and they were also practicing less drift foraging much sooner in the summer. And then in dry months, we predicted that the maximum allowable diversion rates were 16 to 9%, depending on the month, and that any diversions below this rate would maintain rainbow trout energetic condition within the natural range. Notably, this is close to one of the presumptive standards that Richter et al. In 2012 pointed out, that 10% of diversion should provide a high protection rate for natural function. And that study wasn't focused on rainbow trout at all. It was focused on quite a different fish and other geomorphic objectives. So this 10% range is kind of being validated here in our study. We also found that bioenergetic models are this tool that can integrate changes in biological and physical responses into one metric that varies with flow. And in this case, this is NREI that changes with depth, velocity, and food resources, which can really mediate how a fish experiences temperature in a river. And these models can be used to directly address tier 1 of fish in good condition. We also found that the unimpaired conditions can provide a really valuable point of reference to develop ecological risk thresholds, and that percent of diversion rates are inherently holistic in protecting these functional flows. And that this kind of risk-based framework could be used for many flow ecology or flow geomorphology relationships. Ceph metrics are a place to start that can potentially help guide our in-stream flows and predictions. And that's an amazing tool that's available for streams throughout the state. But I also noted here that we can't forget about our conceptual model and what the roles of flows are in different months. And so we found that NREI was probably not the best metric in high flow months because of the flow NREI curve, and because it's probably a time when NREI is naturally lower in the system anyways. And so we should think about using it in months when it is more appropriate. And so developing a conceptual model to guide our in-stream flow assessments ahead of time can help us think about which flow ecology relationships to apply at certain months and times of the year in this risk-based framework. I also want to point out that this framework kind of shifts the burden of proof. And in the past, technical studies have been used to justify minimum flows, but we think technical studies can be used to identify thresholds for ecological risk. And that's what we did here. But what we didn't answer in our study is how much risk society is willing to take. And so that's a balancing question that needs to be addressed in other processes, and thinking about what the ecological risk versus the societal benefit are of increasing diversions, particularly in this percent of flow diversion rate. But scientific studies can provide a starting point for when the risk begins. So with that, I'm going to show you a link to the paper. You can go download it. It's available on open access. And I think I left a few minutes for questions.
Great, thank you. Does anybody have any questions? Go ahead and raise your hand and I can call on you. Conrad.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, great presentation. I was just kind of wanting to focus on management objective at the outset. I feel like the methodology is strong and I definitely could not critique it, but the management objective being specifically fish in good condition. I guess my short question is there a way to translate that to other legal requirements such as survival and recovery of endangered species? Or would that require a whole new study? The problem for the last 30 years in the Scott Shasta has been there are tons of studies, but Water Board consistently says those studies do not provide what the Water Board needs to actually implement them. The most consistent response I get is, well, the recommendations need to be consistent with the laws that can be enforced and can become in-stream flow requirements. So could this be converted to that without a whole new study?
I think I would need to have a more in-depth conversation with you, but I want to say yes. I mean, growth is essential to survival, and maintaining growth in a way like you have to grow and you have to eat food or you're going to die if you're a fish. And so you can, draw some lines in your logic there. But it'd be great to follow up with you and have a longer conversation.
Thanks.
Abigail?
Hey, I was just kind of curious. I was trying to wrap my head around this, and you were saying you guys focused on the pool habitats as they were the most conservative. And I totally understand how that makes sense where it's the most like biological functions are happening. Are there shallower habitats that are more at risk for drying out, like the riffles that are shallower? If you diverted more, it just seems like that would be, easier to dry up. I just wondered if you could, I don't know, explain a little bit about that.
Yeah, and I think that's where like bringing in other metrics too can help. So there are studies that focus more specifically on riffle depth and kind of the loss of connectivity from riffles. You can think about this in the riffle crust depth is one metric that we can use. A standard metric that we can use to think about riffle depth. Also in this framework, pools will quickly become not profitable habitats as riffles dry because the food inputs will go to zero if there's no food coming into the pool. In this particular time period that we were thinking about, we did not see riffles dry. Historically, even if we look like 20 years ago in this particular place, riffles were drying. And so we would predict that NRAI would drop to zero in pool habitats. And so thinking about the pool habitats also encompasses the riffle habitats in that way because they're inherently connected.
Thank you so much. That gives me so much more context to kind of put it in a better framework in my brain.
Yeah.
David?
Yeah, thank you both. A lot of information in a short time. I'm wondering if you can speak to how transferable your findings are to anadromous fish, say, which tend to get more attention these days.
Yeah, I think we could certainly use this framework to think about instead of juvenile rearing rainbow trout, we could think about them as juvenile steelhead trout instead. And they have a lot of the same rearing requirements and energetic requirements as juvenile fish. If we were to think about, adult salmon in this part of this part of the river, there would be other things that we would want to think about, like passage and spawning for an anadromous fish differs from a resident fish. But this particular juvenile bioenergetics drift foraging model is like very transferable to juvenile steelhead trout and probably other salmonids too, with some adjustments.
All right, any other questions? All right, well, and I also want to note there's a couple links that were dropped in the chat here for both the Moyle paper that was discussed, as well as direct links to the to this paper here on the Wiley. And we'll also send those links out to everybody in a follow-up email from the meeting as well. So thank you, Suzanne and Natalie, for your excellent presentation.
Yeah.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you. And I also will just plug that, we worked hard to make sure that this is open source to folks, and we really do believe in having transparent public data. So if other folks need this data, we're in the process of trying to find a place to upload all of this data to, but please do reach out to us if you have questions or if you need information for your work as well. Thanks again.
Great, thank you. There are, if you have a moment, there are a couple more questions that are popping into the chat here. One of them
Yeah,
is,
I'll respond to those too.
Okay, great, thank you.
Oh yeah, well, quickly I can respond to this last one if we have a few minutes on how does this work during drought. And I think this is kind of one of the beauty of this percent of flow diversion frameworks is that there's no specific water year typing that's needed. So even in a dry year, we think that diverting 16% in July will maintain trout energetics within the unimpaired range. And so that's thinking about the fact that in a dry year, naturally fish are going to have bad years, but this will be, contradicted against in wet years when they have better years. And using this percent of flow diversion framework kind of allows for that natural variation to occur without having to do this specific water year typing exercise. Okay, I think that was the last question in the chat. Thanks.
Yes, it is. Thank you. Thank you both. All right, so next up we have Eli Asarian with Riverbend Sciences, presentation on evaluating hydrologic effects of Scott and Shasta irrigation curtailments using remote sensing and stream flow gauging.
Okay. Hopefully you are seeing my screen and hearing me.
Yeah, both.
Yes. Okay, great. Well, thank you for the opportunity to talk with you today. I'm going to present results from a project that I have been working on in the Shasta and Scott for the past year or so, looking at the effects of irrigation curtailment using primarily remote sensing, but a little bit of stream flow gauging as well. So I finished a report back in September that is available on my website if you want to download that. It was funded by the Klamath Tribal Water Quality Consortium. And then I'm working now on transforming this into a manuscript for peer review. And I brought in some folks to help me with that. Bonwin Stanford and Nicholas Murphy from the Nature Conservancy, who I think are in the meeting today, and Michael Pollock from NOAA Fisheries. So this report, or this upcoming manuscript that we're working on includes a lot of the same analyses or some updated version, and then some new analyses as well. So just a note here that I'm presenting provisional results today. So for those of you unfamiliar with the Shasta and Scott rivers, they are tributaries of the Klamath River up in far northern California. There's a lot of agricultural lands and irrigation. And this map just here shows some of the major landmarks like the city of Wairika and the location of the agricultural fields and the stream flow gauges that we used in the analysis. So in 2021, there was a drought emergency declared, and there were curtailments of surface water diversions and groundwater pumping. However, in 2021, those didn't go into effect until September 10th, by which time irrigation season was pretty much already over. So we're really focusing this analysis on the year 2022, when those curtailments had their full effect. And I'm just showing here on the right the flow data, with the red line being 2022 in Shasta and Scott, and then the median being the thick gray. So in 2022, you can see that the red line there for 2022 tracks pretty closely with what the emergency minimum flows were. The water master was essentially, once the curtailments went into effect in the spring, the water master was turning down diversions to meet those emergency minimum flows, and it worked pretty well, except in late August when there was a large diverter that turned on in violation of the curtailments. In the Scott River, the flows, was a good amount of spring runoff, and so the flows in the river did not drop below the emergency minimums till early July, and then surface water and groundwater were curtailed. The groundwater pumping was allowed to continue under local cooperative solutions, which I'll talk about more in a moment. But just wanted to point out here, if you compare the relationship between the red and the thick gray lines for Scott River, 2022, the flows pretty much tracked what the median flows are for the past 10 years or so, which is pretty similar to what happened in the Salmon River, which is, you could use as sort of a hydrologic reference for the Scott. It's just over the mountain to the west. And so while we saw much higher flows in the Shasta than is typical for recent years, in 2022 in Scott, things pretty much tracked as you would expect based on the hydrologic conditions. And in the but a couple of the tributaries of the Scott, namely Shackelford Creek and French Creek, we did see elevated flows in 2022 due to the curtailments. So as I mentioned, there were these local cooperative solutions, or LCS, and these were primarily in the Scott River for groundwater, and these were landowner developed agreements where the landowners came up with a plan to reduce their diversions by 30% during the irrigation season through a combination of whatever practices they thought worked best for their farm. So usually a combination of upgrades to irrigation equipment, switching to less water thirsty crops like a greater percent of grain, not irrigating maybe the corners of fields or some whole fields, and then reducing early cutoff of irrigation for alfalfa. So only doing 2 or 3 cuttings instead of 3 or 4 cuttings. The pumping was all self-reported. There were some field visits and verification by the Siskiyou RCD and California Fish and Wildlife, and a really high percent of the groundwater irrigators in the Scott River signed up for this program. So I wanted to see, well, what could we tell about what happened in these fields using the tools of satellite remote sensing? I'm relying today on data generated primarily from these 3 tools: OpenET, the Climate Engine, and the Sentinel Hub. And a lot of the data summaries that I'm presenting today took a lot of work and customization, but the basic underlying data of accessing the satellite imagery or doing fields at a small spatial scale are actually really easy to do using these websites. And so I encourage everyone to check these out and play around with them, because they're a lot easier to use than you might think. And I have some tutorials on my website if folks are interested in that. So what type of remote sensing do we have available? Every few years, there is high resolution aerial photos from Department of Agriculture. Every 5 days, we have a 10-meter resolution imagery from the European Space Agency, the Sentinel-2 satellite. And then NASA and USGS have the Landsat satellite, which flies over about once a week, and it's got a 30-meter resolution. So you can just sort of see what these fields here in the Scott Valley around Fort Jones, a little north of Fort Jones, what they look like with these different imagery sources. I'm going to focus mostly on the Landsat data today. A couple or other things that can be done with this data, in addition to just looking at the imagery, is calculating spectral indices, these different measures of greenness of the fields. And so you can see these, center pivot irrigation versus the fallowed fields. One great thing that Landsat has that's really unique is a thermal sensor, and it's able to sense the skin temperature of the Earth, whether that be rocks or the leaves or whatever is the first surface that the satellite can see. And so you can see those center pivots are nice and cool, whereas the fallowed fields are much warmer, and the dry hillsides are much warmer. And so the satellite is sensing that skin temperature, and just as if you were outside on a hot day and you sweat and it's windy, the wind will evaporate your sweat, and that cools down your skin. It's the same thing on the surface of a leaf. When that plant is transpiring water through its leaves, it cools down the surface of the leaf, and the satellites can sense that, and that that thermal sensor is sort of the fundamental component of remotely sensing water use from space. Here's just an example of an animation from the Sentinel-2 satellite showing every 5 days for this multi-year period the greenness of the fields, and you can see the cutting cycles of the alfalfa. It is really easy to generate these animations for any area that you're interested in. Once you learn how to do it, it literally only takes 15 minutes or something like that. So it's a really high spatial temporal resolution. So here's some example images from the Sentinel-2 satellite of an index of greenness comparing 2020 and 2022 in mid-August in the Shasta and the Scott. And I've circled in the Shasta areas that were much greener in 2020 than they were in 2022. And I'm just going to kind of flip back and forth here between 2020 and 2022, so you can just sort of see those areas in the ovals in Shasta that were much greener in 2020 than in 2022. Whereas in Scott, you see the greens kind of moving around, they're kind of jumping around with the cutting cycles of the alfalfa, but it's not systematically, more green or less green in one year versus the other in Scott. We can see these same differences in the thermal imagery. So here's that Landsat skin temperature, and you can see in those ovals in 2020 in the Shasta, those fields are nice and cool because they're actively transpiring a lot of water. Whereas if you look in 2022, you see they match more the temperature going on in the dry hillsides and unirrigated areas due to the water stress. So I just wanted to show you some of that raw satellite imagery so you can better understand the inputs that go into this sensing of the water use. And now I'm going to provide some background information on what consumptive use is. What is evapotranspiration? What is irrigation efficiency, and what relevance do these have to water budgets and stream flows? So here's a very basic agricultural water cycle. You got precipitation becomes runoff and is stream flow, and then that water is diverted from the stream. It's applied to a field, and then some of that goes up into the atmosphere as evapotranspiration. That's a consumptive use. That water, once it's used, is not available anymore. But there's a good amount of that water that then returns to the stream, either directly over the surface, or it goes into the groundwater and returned later. So that water is not actually lost, and the source, or the runoff from one farm, the excess water from one farm, becomes a source to the river or a source to a downstream farm. So it's not, that water is not destroyed, those return flows. So let's look at that a little bit more of a detailed level, and we'll break this into more buckets. So those consumptive uses can be divided into productive uses. That's the transpiration of the crop. That's when water gets, the irrigation goes into the ground, it's pulled up into the leaves, the crop transpires it, the crop is growing, it's producing food, it's producing income to the farmers, and it's doing good productive things, right? On the other hand, we have water that is just truly wasted and provides no benefits. So if the sprinkler kicks the drops high up into the air and they're carried away by the wind, they're never going to reach the crop and the soil. We also have water that lands on the leaves of the crop, and that water doesn't help the plant grow. It just evaporates off. It actually suppresses growth of the crop. Or you have water that makes it to the soil, but it's not taken up by the roots of the crop, and instead it's just evaporated from the soil. So that water is just wasted. There's no benefits that come from it. And then we have those return flows, which, as I showed in the previous diagram, either return to the stream or return to the groundwater, and then later to the stream, or pulled up by a well for irrigation. And in the Shasta and Scott, all return flows are reusable. In some places, if you have really salty groundwater, you could have water that once it gets in the ground, it's not usable anymore, but that doesn't apply to Shasta and Scott. So when we're trying to prioritize how should we conserve water at the basin scale, we should really focus on first on reducing that unproductive wasted water, getting rid of those sprinkler losses, for example, because that's water that just isn't accomplishing anything of value. You know, depending on how much water we need to save, we may also need to reduce some of the productive use, but you know, obviously that harms agriculture, so we don't want to do that if it's not necessary. So how do we save that water? So Awar and Peters have this great paper called "The More You Expose, the More You Lose," and they talk about different irrigation systems and their level of sprinkler losses that they have. And I've sort of ranked these from highest consumptive use to least consumptive use. And you know, by moving from left to right, you could save, depending on how far you're going, you know, something like 5 to 20 or even higher percent, depending on how many steps you go in this chain. So what you want to do is you want to move the sprinklers as close to the ground as you can, so they're less exposed to the wind. You want to decrease the pressure, increase the nozzle size, and throw large drops that can get all the way to the ground. But you also have to, you know, you still want to have uniform distribution and you know, not apply water faster than it can soak into the soil. So that LIPA system on the right there, that low energy precision application, is a really great system because there's no losses on the canopy or to the wind. And then, you know, drip irrigation is even better, but it's not very feasible for crops like alfalfa or pasture, and it's not really used in Shasta and Scott, but in other systems it is applicable. So how do we measure ET? We can do that using sophisticated field equipment that, you know, I would have no idea how to do that. It takes a lot of training. It's really expensive equipment, so it's not done very often. You can make assumptions about, well, if the field is fully watered, you can use weather data to calculate what's called a reference evapotranspiration, or ETO, also called evaporative demand. And that's based on the air temperature, the wind speed, solar radiation, and I think relative humidity. There's 4 factors. That's purely based on the climate. And then you multiply that by a crop coefficient, which is usually on a 0 to 1 scale, about how much water that crop would use relative to a reference crop of irrigated grass or alfalfa. Or you can use remote sensing, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. And as I touched on before, this remote sensing is really based most strongly on that thermal sensor from the Landsat satellite, because it can tell what fields are actively transpiring versus what fields are drought stressed. I'm using data from OpenET, which is a collaborative project of federal agencies, universities, nonprofit organizations, private companies like Google. They have 6 different methods for calculating ET, and they average them together to get a final ensemble average. It's calculated at a 30-meter pixel scale for every 30-meter pixel across the entire Western United States. Then it's aggregated up into agricultural fields, and then I took that data that OpenET produced and summarized it to the watershed scales. So I wanted to give a brief overview of how OpenET works at a very basic intro level to try to demystify it for you a bit. So the starting point is the gridded weather data. So spatial CIMIS is the main one. So that's a combination of ground-based weather stations that are spatially interpolated, so you can get weather across the whole landscape, the air temperature, wind speed, etc. From that, you calculate that reference ET, or the ETO, and that is the ET you'd get if you had a fully irrigated crop. And then the satellite data, which is primarily from that Landsat thermal temperature, that is used to calculate the percent of reference ET for each pixel across the landscape. So it's sort of similar to that crop coefficient that I mentioned in the previous slide, only it's dynamically changing in time and space according to the satellite measurements. You know, there's days when it's cloudy and you don't have satellite data, so they gotta fill the gaps. And once you fill the gaps, then you essentially just multiply together the reference ET by the percent of the reference ET. And that gives you the ETA, or the actual evapotranspiration for each pixel. Then you take the GIS boundaries of agricultural fields and multiply and use that as to spatially summarize, so you can get an ET time series for every field. So this open ET data, there was a new paper just came out in the last few weeks. It's a validation study using sites from across the country, not just crop sites, but also wetlands and grasslands and forests, and comparing the model predictions against these really detailed field measurements from what's called an eddy flux tower. So they had 53 crop sites that they ran validation on. Here's an example of what the monthly predictions look like, and the average error on a monthly basis is about 17%. For a whole growing season, it's a little lower, around 13%. So now let's talk about some results for the Shasta River. So this is a 5 or 6 year time series for the March through October growing season, and I'll walk you through what these different lines are. So on top there is the reference evapotranspiration, or the ETO, and that is how much water would be used if the crop, if it was a crop of grass that was fully irrigated. That's based solely on the weather data. And then you have the ETA, or the actual evapotranspiration. That's the orange line there, and that's the open ET main prediction that they provide, which is that flux of water from the fields up into the atmosphere. So what we see in Shasta here is we have a 24% reduction between 2020 and 2022. It's a pretty large reduction. And the pink at the bottom there is the precipitation, and there was a little bit more precipitation during the growing season in 2022 in the Shasta than there was in 2020. And so, if there's water falling from the sky during the growing season, that means that the farmers don't need to apply as much irrigation, right, to meet the crop demands. And so that's what net evapotranspiration is. The purple line there is it's ETA minus the precipitation. And that's sort of a very coarse estimate of how much water a farmer would need to apply to the field in order to get the amount of ETA that was measured in the field. It doesn't account for things like changes in the soil moisture over the irrigation season, or the efficiency of the sprinklers, but it's a pretty decent estimate of applied water, or at least a relative comparison of applied water. And so that went down about 32% in the Shasta between 2020 and 2022. If we compare that to the Scott River, what we see is that the ETA, the actual evapotranspiration, was very similar. It went up by about 1% between 2020 and 2022. The net evapotranspiration, ETN, that went down. That's the purple line. That went down about 5%, and that's primarily because we got a good amount more rain in the Scott in 2022 than in 2020, about 50% more rain. So in order to maintain the same levels of production, the farmers would not have to apply quite as much irrigation water. We can also look at this on a monthly basis, these different terms, and actually that the data in the previous slide is just these months all summed together to the growing season. So the only thing I really wanted to point out here was the actual evapotranspiration in the Shasta. You can see that in 2022, that red line is much lower than the black line, the baseline. And it wasn't like just the end of the irrigation season. It was through the whole season. There was less ET in the crop fields in the Shasta. For the greenness of the fields, we see a similar pattern where it was actually a little bit greener in the Scott in 2022 earlier in the year due to that more springtime precipitation and early summer precip. But in the Shasta, the fields were not nearly as green in 2022 once the spring rain stopped. Here's maps of the percent reduction from 2020 to 2022 in the Shasta and Scott for every agricultural field. And I've highlighted in the gray polygon on the left there, that is the local cooperative solutions. Those were aggregated together. So you can see that there was much greater, the darker colors are greater percent reductions, much greater reductions in the Shasta than in the Scott. I'm gonna shrink these maps a little bit so that I have room to show you just a bar chart that's just the same data. It's just showing the percent of the total agricultural field area in each of those reduction categories. So the colors are all the same across this graph. So in the Shasta, or sorry, in the Scott, in the top plot there, in the top map, about 40% of the area had an increase in net ET, and then it is about 25% that had less than a 10% reduction. Whereas in the Shasta, the largest category was a greater than 50% reduction. So there's really large areas of the Shasta where there was major reductions in net ET. We also parsed the results by irrigation source. The two main sources are groundwater, and that's primarily in the Scott, that's the pink, and then surface water in the Shasta is that sort of teal green color. So the y-axis here shows the total volume of water for the year, and so you can see most of the ET in the Scott comes from fields that are irrigated with groundwater, whereas in the Shasta, most of the irrigation is surface water. And it looks like I cut off the first year a little bit. I got to expand the y-axis a little bit here. And so the surface water decline between 2020 and 2022 in the Shasta was about 34% for the surface water and 25% for the groundwater, because there were some areas of the Shasta that where groundwater was curtailed, namely the Big Springs irrigation district. So moving on now to the local cooperative solutions, or the LCS. Here's just a map, showing where they are around Scott Valley. Each of these dots here represents one of the LCS ranches, the LCS properties, and the different size of the dots corresponds to how big that ranch is in hectares. And then the x-axis is the actual ET for 2020. The y-axis is the actual ET for 2022. So points that are above the 0% line, that means they had an increase in water use, and ranches that are below the 0% line means they had a reduction in water use. So you see there's a spread where many of them had an increase, but there were some that had some decreases as well. And the average reduction was about 1%. If we look at net ET, and remember that's the one that deducts precipitation, because when it's raining, we don't need to water as much. The average reduction was around 7%. But most ranches are in the 5 to 10% reduction, something like that. And there were, if you look at the 30% reduction line, you'll see there's two small ranches that did meet a 30% reduction target. And here's a map just showing the same data, just in map form of the net ET. So why wasn't there a larger percent reduction in the Scott? People said they were going to reduce their pumping by 30%, and we don't see that, at least in the ET data. So here's estimates of the amount of water that is applied in the Scott Valley integrated hydrologic model that was developed by UC Davis and is used for water management purposes in the Scott. So the initial version of the model estimated that there was about 30 inches of application, and then the alfalfa farmers in the valley said, there's just no way we're using that much water. We're not applying that much water. And they did some studies of about several ranches in the valley and measured things really carefully, and they came up with a much lower value of irrigation. And so then the model was sort of reconfigured to use that lower amount of irrigation. And then when people went to file their LCS applications, when there was the pending curtailments, the average that people reported as their baseline usage was 44 inches. And in fact, only 6 of 46 of people reported baseline usage less than or equal to that 22 inches. That's in the model. And there's a pretty strong incentive to do this because people had to promise they were going to reduce their usage by 30%. So if you could say that you had much greater usage as your baseline, then you wouldn't have to reduce your usage in 2022 by either as much or perhaps even if at all. And so it's I don't know what is the real number of what people are actually doing out there, because there's essentially no metering of any of the wells in Scott Valley. If I had to make a guess, I would say that the true number is probably somewhere closer to 30 than it is to either 22 or 44. But hopefully this year the water board is requiring meters as part of the new in-stream flow program, and so hopefully we'll get some real data this year that can be used to answer these questions. But for the time being, we're living in sort of a parallel universe where the model is saying there's not much irrigation being applied, and then but then when people are filing their baselines, they're saying they're using a lot more, and we just don't really know what is the actual. So in conclusion, the curtailments reduced ET and net ET in the Shasta pretty substantially. However, in the Scott, there was not a reduction in the actual ET, but because we had more rain in 2022, it did reduce the net ET, not nearly by 30%, but by some amount. I think part of this is due to the difference in irrigation systems. The Shasta is mostly surface water, and it's mostly water mastered, where there's a few large ditches that most of the water runs through, and so the water master can go and see what people are using and regulate people up and down. Whereas in the Scott, it's mostly groundwater use, and everyone has their own well and can essentially do whatever they want. And the LCS program appears to be ineffective at reducing pumping, or at least it didn't reduce it by the levels that the program was designed for. I think probably the single biggest factor was the opportunity and the incentive for people to inflate what their baseline use was. And there's no meeting or measurement of the use. It's all based on estimates anyway. And there was some independent verification, but it's hard to tell by just going out to someone's farm once or twice during the year what's really going on a day-to-day basis. So I recommend additional data collection, like the metering that I mentioned. That will help answer questions about how much water is actually being applied, and then also getting better maps of what practices were people doing in specific fields. And we could use that to look at compliance to see, was the field followed, if people said it was going to be followed, and which practices effectively reduce ET. So that's it, and thank you. I'll take any questions if we have time.
Thank you, Eli. Questions from the group? Raise your hand if you have a question, or drop in chat. Conrad, you jumped on, so I assume you have a question.
I don't always want to go first if somebody else wants to go. The LCS discussion was amazing, and the inflated baselines, we deal with this a lot in water users seeking funds to do in-stream dedications paired with infrastructure, and inflating baselines is a way to basically get public money where it maybe isn't deserved. I guess, how do we feel, either Eli or water board, about just sidestepping that entire issue and instead looking at what a crop actually needs? I mean, the water law says your right is limited not necessarily to what's on paper, but to what is reasonably needed to achieve what your stated objective is. We know how much an acre of alfalfa uses, so how about instead of finding historic quantities of diversions, we just figure out what certain acres need, certain crops need.
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense if there's going to be management of how much water people can apply, how much groundwater people can pump. It makes sense to base it on something that is more uniform, based on the soil type or the crop type or something like that. And like for example, if somebody invested hundreds of thousands of dollars of their own money and some public money in irrigation efficiency stuff, like 5 years ago, why it seems like they should get credit for being an early actor to increase their efficiency, whereas someone who didn't do anything until the last year or so, when it's really required, then it's like people have been wasting more water, have been getting extra credit if everything's based on a % reduction from historical. And I think also, given the lack of meters and things, I think it does make sense to have some type of more inches of water that you can apply per irrigated acre or something like that. So, but that's, I don't know if the water board has any wants to respond to that. Or,
Yeah, well, I was curious, Eli, do you have a paper or anything to go with this that we could share with the group, and I can pass on to the team that works in the Scott Shasta?
Yes, I have. I can I could put the link in the chat for the report. Great. And then the publication will be upcoming. We're hoping to submit it in, I keep saying in a few weeks, but that's probably unrealistic. But so I think it'll probably be out sometime, probably final sometime this year, the manuscript.
Okay, yeah, because we would appreciate that information. It would help us, better make decisions as well, and evaluate the effectiveness of the LCSs in our decision.
Yeah, because there's going to be
actually work in the Scott Shasta, so
yeah.
It's a little outside of my purview. I'm not really tracking it super close. So, but yeah, that'd be very helpful.
A lot of these methods that I developed could be used. There's another round of LCSs coming this year, so these tools are available for looking at that stuff.
Great.
Anyone else have any questions?
It looks like Abigail has a question.
I just had a quick one, just for context. I was wondering if most of the users in these two valleys had the same, equal water rights, or if there were any seniors or juniors that were sort of harder to parse apart.
Yeah, that's a good question. I believe that in the Scott, all groundwater users were given sort of equal priority, which was actually sort of senior to the most senior surface water rights. The surface water got curtailed, earlier than the groundwater did, and it was much harder. It was possible to get an LCS for surface water, but you had to show a really high bar of effectiveness. And so I think only one person one ranch in the Scott got an LCS. In the Shasta, for the most part, the water, because it's mostly surface water, the regulation was done according to priority rights, and there's a big gradation from most senior to least senior. And so there's some people that get shut off every year, even if there's not a curtailment, but additional people, a little bit more senior people got cut off this year in the Shasta. And then they also did curtail the Big Springs irrigation district, which pumps groundwater, but it's not like groundwater that's pumped and then used on the same property. It's more like pumped into a big ditch and then goes out to a bunch of different properties. And it originally, I think, was a surface right that sometime in past decades was converted to a groundwater right. And so it's more of an appropriative right, even though it's groundwater. I don't know all the details of that, but I think I hopefully got that mostly right. And if anyone wants to chime in with a better, go ahead.
The nuance there is groundwater is considered equivalent to a riparian right. Is the easiest way to think about it in the water rights priority system. And riparian rights are the most senior to any appropriative rights. the nuance with the regulation was trying to recognize that it's not a one-to-one relationship necessarily with groundwater diversion to surface water diversion, and trying to build that into the way the regulation was structured.
Thank you.
Which is why surface water got curtailed first and then groundwater second. That makes sense. Looks like there's something in chat. Let me just double check it.
Yeah, looks like Alex.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it looks like we have your report listed on our Scott Shasta Drought webpage.
Yeah.
So excellent. Any other questions? All right, seeing none. Thank you very much, Eli. It was great having you. So let's see, moving along here. Next up on our agenda is a discussion of providing some updates on the SEF California Environmental Flows Framework Work Plan, presented by the SEF technical team. I'm not sure who's going to lead the presentation. Looks like Bronwyn jumped on.
Yeah, I can start us off, and then others can jump in as well. I think it looks like there's some good representation on the call today. So the SEF technical team sort of gathered some feedback from some of the folks who've been using SEF as we laid it out in the technical document and some of their own processes, as well as with some members of agencies to try to think about what might be useful next steps to help continue making this tool clearer, more usable, helping sort of make links between it and other existing tools and help people understand and use it where that makes sense. And we came up with a short list of priorities I can share with all of you. And I think we'd be really interested in hearing if there are other ideas on things that would be most helpful to you, or things that you've wondered about, and as well as sort of how, so if there are things we've missed, if there are ways that you would prioritize these tasks as we look for funding, and also if you have ideas on places that we could turn to get some funding or support for continuing to work on stuff and continue to make it better and more useful. So let me just share very briefly. This is just a work plan that we assembled with some of the main tasks that we've been thinking about. And a key one that we see is outreach and education. So continuing to develop materials that communicate more clearly, especially to non-technical audiences, what SEF is, how they might use it. And this could include development of better graphics, executive summary, sort of clear communication around sort of how we modeled the functional flow metrics so that people can fit it into their understanding of other in-stream flow methods and modeling, and make sure that they're understanding the strengths and weaknesses appropriately. And then outreach plans to public and state agencies and potential initial training. So we sort of saw that as a really high priority. We have a second task or bucket of work, which is doing some model evaluations and comparisons. So this includes two key pieces. One is making some updates to the functional flows model, including sort of improving the workflow so that it is more easily reproducible and open source, and fixing some of the errors that have been identified in the underlying NHD data set that are then sort of continue on through the functional flow modeling for areas where the NHD is poor. And then also doing some comparisons of the functional flow modeling with more site-specific or regional models, such as groundwater surface water models, that other people, or some of the modeling that that DWR works with, to try to understand how they are where they're similar, where they're different, and how we could think about which one's more appropriate for different types of questions, or where they align really well. So that's sort of a more sort of modeling data technical side. And then the third one is moving more towards implementation guidance. So summarizing some of the case studies where Ceph has been used already to help understand what we learned from that, where Ceph performed, well, sort of how we had to adapt it, or how provide some real examples of how folks have walked through the different steps within Ceph. And then another one is sort of continuing to work on guidance for how to implement functional flows in different contexts, or how Ceph could be applied in different types of streams to help make that a little bit clearer and more streamlined. So this one's more focused on like, how would I go about using Ceph? What are some examples I can draw from, and what might be recommendations for how this could be approached differently in different types of streams? So those are sort of the three core pieces that we've identified. And I guess I'd invite anyone else from the technical team to jump on and share. And also, if anyone has thoughts on different priorities or ways that we could work to get some of these tasks funded, that would be really great to hear as well.
Do anyone have any thoughts, questions, or recommendations? David.
Well, I'm afraid I can't address what you just asked for exactly. If you could give us a written copy of that, it would be helpful. But I was wondering, in your work, you did some work on Little Shasta as sort of a pilot, and ran into some problems where, if I understand the problems correctly, water was being wheeled great distances from one subwatershed to another, and the water that was being wheeled was winter stored water versus natural runoff from a given time of year. Have you got any answers, solutions, approaches that will help you address those problems, since so much of California is irrigated with wheeled water, and teasing out what the natural flows might have been or should be is going to be hard everywhere?
So Sarah is online, and Sarah can led that case study and can speak more directly to it. I guess I just start by saying the natural flows database isn't looking at water use. So it's really focusing on unimpaired flow, and it doesn't actually take current irrigation practices into account to understand that, because it's this model that's built on reference gauges across the state. But Sarah, did you have any more to add about that example?
No, I think I was going to make a similar comment, Bronwyn, that so the natural reference functional flow metrics and the flows database, that where section A, the first initial cut of section A functional flow metrics comes from, are based on these reference gauges. So the accounting for how water gets moved is really something that comes into play when you're looking in section C of Ceph, and doesn't come into play when we're looking at ecological flow criteria. So how you go about coming up with reference flows and unimpaired flows, there's a whole variety of methods that are out there. What we've provided in Ceph via the natural flows database is the statewide modeling effort of monthly unimpaired flows and functional flow metrics. And so that's a place to start. Other places in the state and other case studies have also used unimpaired flow models. So for example, some of the case studies that have been done down in Southern California have used local unimpaired flow models. So there's different ways that you could get at that unimpaired flow question specifically.
Thank you, Sarah. Any additional questions, comments? All right, thank you, Bronwyn.
And I guess to David's first point, I think we'd be happy to post this on the Ceph website if that's useful to folks. And then I see Chris Conrad and Chris had comments in the chat too.
Go ahead, Conrad.
Mine's in the chat. It was to consider or start making management objectives that are consistent with tribal beneficial uses. And we had a long discussion about that during the DEI meeting. That's the most important one. And the other is, I think we could all learn from each other to understand why in-stream flow recommendations have not historically led to in-stream flows. But first one, I'd love to really push for that, since that was kind of the outcome of the DEI discussion.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for that.
Looks like Chris has a comment. SEP is being used in the Sigma implementation of sustainability work plans on the Napa. Can you speak to this project or schedule a presentation on this? SEP
So
is
I
being used to
think
determine where to place intensive dual monitoring sites for surface and groundwater GD interaction.
Do you know who's leading that work, Chris?
I think Stillwater Sciences is leading that work, and there was some initial consultation with myself and with Sarah Yarnell about 6 months ago. I'm not exactly sure where things stand now, but we can certainly follow up with our contacts at Stillwater, Chris, and see if they're at a point where they might be able to present to this group, because I think there is a lot of interest in understanding how SEF and SEF related products might be used in the Sigma in Sigma planning processes.
Thanks, Ted. I'll just add that I believe the sustainability plans, the GSP sustainability plans for the Napa, the draft plans are were out for public review, I think in January, and might have closed just recently. So there should be some additional updates on that process from the folks doing that work, I would think, in the next month or two.
Thank you, Ted and Sarah. There's an additional question on, has anyone implemented Part C, the balancing part? Like, I don't think we have a case of a local cooperative solution or a voluntary agreement that's implemented Section C, but I might be wrong. But the silence, I'm thinking we do not have a full pass through of Section A, B, and C yet, but still working on that. Any other questions or comments? All right, I'm seeing none. Thank you, Bronwyn. We now move to our round robin component of our agenda. This is for anybody that would like to provide any update. On my end, I do have an update for the Eel River and surrounding tributaries. We did finish going through our demand data that's submitted to us. So in water rights, everybody's required to submit how much water they used on a monthly basis every year. And there's typically a lot of errors in those data sets that we need to correct. We finalized a QA/QC demand data set for what we call the North Coast Cannabis Policy Region. Includes the Eel River up north to Redwood Creek and the Mad River. It's available on our website. I'm going to drop the link in the chat. We'll also send it out if anybody's interested in reviewing that data set. So any other updates? Folks can go ahead and raise their hand if you have an update you'd like to provide. David.
Yeah, for those who haven't heard, recently a group of us of environmental organizations have submitted a petition to the State Water Board to establish a defined in-stream flow for the Shasta River, similar to what was filed earlier for the Scott. Clearly, to be done right, it needs a synthesis of a method like the first one we heard about today, combined with SEF to deal with the biological and channel shaping flow needs. So hopefully, those two processes can somehow be meshed together and made usable in the time frame that the Water Board needs, which is during the next 5 years. So that's an update from the Shasta.
Thank you, David. Anybody else have anything they'd like to share? . All right, well, we'll be ending a little early, it looks like today. I want to thank everybody for attending today's meeting, and we look forward to the next one. As always, if you have any ideas for presentations or anything that you would like us to try to get on the agenda, please go ahead and let me know. Scott.
Can we ask you for an update on something? Yeah. I was just curious if you have any other updates on the water temperature model that's being developed. Kind of where are you guys at on that in the water budget model for the Shasta with paradigm?
I don't know if anybody's on the call. Is there anybody from the board on the call, Scott Shasta? I apologize, Scott. I don't think we have anybody on the call to answer that question. But if you want to shoot me an email, I can get you in touch with the appropriate staff.
Okay, I could just ask Bob again too. That's where you'd send me anyways. Okay.
That's probably easiest. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Hey, Daniel, can I give just a quick shout out for the Scott Watershed Informational Forum next week? It's here in the Scott Valley. There's a 3-day event. It's free to the public. A full tour of some of the restoration sites on Wednesday, a full set of multiple different types of presentations on Thursday, and then a deeper dive into soil health and some of the stuff that the ag community is doing on water conservation here in the Scott. So I'll post that link to the website, but if anybody wants it, it's on scottriver.org. Thanks.
Great, thank you.
And this is Eli. I have an announcement also. The Salmon Restoration Federation conference is going to be March 26th to 29th, and there's quite a few hydrology, groundwater, in-stream flow content at that conference. So I want to encourage anyone who's interested to come to that. And so the website for that is calsalmon.org. And there's still registration spots available. So. And if you want to see my presentation again, I'll be presenting it there. But lots of other stuff too. Lots of other good stuff.
Thank you, Eli. Anybody else? All right. Well, thank you all for attending. Hope you have a great rest of your day and a good long weekend coming up. We'll see you. Oh, one other thing I just wanted to mention again is there was the email sent out earlier for the meeting appointment. If you didn't get that, we'll go ahead and send back out when we send the follow-up to this meeting, the additional meetings for the upcoming rest of the year. You need to actually click on the meeting and then download it for it to be added to your calendar. It's a little clunky, but it's the best we can do. And make sure that everybody has the same meeting appointment. So please make sure you do, or if you forward them on to anybody else, it's probably easiest to take that email that comes out and attach it to your email and have them download it. So that was my last bit. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.